This is the Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast, a podcast brought to you by two physical therapists devoted to helping physical therapists and other healthcare providers become better educators to patients, students, the community, and each other by interviewing prominent and passionate people within the realms of healthcare and education. The Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast is intended literally for educational and entertainment purposes only. No clinical decision-making should be based on only one source, and therefore this podcast should not be used as personal medical advice. While care has been taken to ensure accuracy, occasionally mistakes and factual errors can be present, as we are only human. This is our journey on the road to becoming better educators, so get ready with your pen and paper as class is about to begin. Welcome to the Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast. I'm Brandon Powen, and I am joined, as always, by my co-host, F. Scott Fiel. And today we are very humbled to bring you a very special guest in the fitness and strength and conditioning realm. For today's episode, we bring you Brett Bartholomew. Now, for those who don't know who Brett is, he is a strength and conditioning coach, author, consultant, and founder of the performance coaching and consulting company, The Bridge. His experience includes working with collegiate teams, professional teams, businesses, and individual clients. Taken together, Brett has coached athletes from across 23 sports at levels ranging from youth to Olympians. He supported Super Bowl and World Series champions, along with several professional fighters, including those competing in the UFC. He has also worked with members of the U.S. Special Forces community. His coaching and speaking has spanned the globe from China to Brazil and numerous other stops in between. His book, Conscious Coaching, The Art and Science of Building Buy-In, on Amazon has achieved a bestseller status in the categories of sports coaching, which is ranked number 1, business and money, ranked number 8, and was ranked in the Amazon's top 100 books overall. Now, he is also a member of the National Strength and Conditioning Association, where he holds both their CSCSD and RSCCD distinctions. He is a proud graduate of Kansas State University, where he obtained his Bachelor's of Science degree in kinesiology, and Southern Illinois University Carbondale, where he obtained a Master's of Science in Education and Exercise Science with an emphasis on motor behavior, cueing, and attentional focus in human performance. Now, Brett, first of all, thank you so much for coming on the show to talk with us, and also for all the hard work that you have done throughout your career, as you truly have contributed to positive changes in your profession. And after reading your book and reading your story, it was very eye-opening to hear what you went through, but at the same time, very inspiring because of what you've done as a result of it. And today's episode is really meant to help establish a dialogue to help bridge the gap between healthcare providers and fitness professionals as we seek to really learn from each other to help best benefit our clients. Now, I realize that I kept your bio pretty brief in the intro, but is there anything that you'd like our audience to know about you that I didn't mention in the intro?
No, first off, I wish you could give that intro. I wish my wife treated me with that amount of, hey, here's all the things he's done, right? Like my wife, and she's like, can you quit talking? Because I always come in coach mode. No, I appreciate that. That was spot on. The main thing, right? Like I just tell people I'm a coach, and the longer I'm in the profession, it's funny when you start off, you want all these distinctions, you want all these things. And then later on you realize, no, the word coach is fine for most things. And that sums up, the majority of what we do. I think coaches, teachers, educators, no matter what realm you're in, if you're trying to basically transfer knowledge and do so in a way that helps other people, that's a pretty classic title and one that's timeless. So I appreciate it. It's my honor to be on the show. Thanks again for having me.
Awesome, Brett. For our audience in the other healthcare and fitness roles who are not aware of the specifics of the material taught in these educational programs, do you think you could briefly go into your educational experience?
Sure, yeah. So I had always been interested in the human body. I go into what got me into that in my book, and a big piece of it is what got me into strength and conditioning in general. But Kansas State University was relatively close to home growing up in Omaha, Nebraska. I knew I wanted to go someplace that had an excellent kind of department from that standpoint, but also was quite a ways from home just because it was a college experience, right? So University of Nebraska is fantastic. And later on in my career, I ended up going to do volunteer work as a strength and conditioning coach during the apprenticeship phase of my career. But I knew I wanted to get farther away from home, Omaha, than 45 minutes. So went to Kansas State University, had a phenomenal experience. I still think they have one of the best exercise physiology or just overall kinesiology programs in the country. I mean, it is very rare, as I found out later in my career as an undergrad, to have the opportunity to work in cadaver labs. Our ex-phys course and advanced ex-phys course was taught by 4 different instructors, all of which whom were subject matter experts in their domain. So, we had a different person give the cardiorespiratory piece, another person give the hormonal adaptations piece, and all these professors were just astonishing. I probably learned more in that from a raw physiology standpoint than I even did deep diving into my graduate domain. My graduate domain was focused more on motor learning. I was really fortunate to find an individual by the name of Dr. Jared Porter. And at the time, I was really just bored with school. And I was thinking, you know what, this is just really a filler between my graduate assistantship coaching responsibilities. I found Dr. Porter and he said, listen, we have a curriculum that can go hand in hand with your coaching. Specifically, it talks about what's called attentional focus. And that basically dives into the science of cueing and how what we say can drive various performance outcomes. So, for example, if somebody's getting ready to do a broad jump, as opposed to giving them an internal focus of attention, which would be based around different anatomical positions, right? So, hey, bend at the waist, load the ankles, knees, and hips, and then spring forward by achieving full extension of the hips. That's a mouthful for most people that are not us, right? And you looked at external focus of attention-based cues, which were always going to be outcome-oriented, such as push the ground away, try to jump to the end of the hallway, focus on jumping to the wall or jump to the end of the tape. Things that just put a different metaphor or analogy piece into, that subconscious, so to speak. And what we found is in most cases, whether you're looking at novice or experts, whether you're looking at simple tasks or more complex, externally focused based cues always enhanced that outcome as opposed to an internal or a controlled condition. Now, of course, there are some studies, especially more recent ones, and one that I did that showed that that's not always the case. So I guess I should go back and bite my tongue with saying always, but the vast majority of the time would be a little bit more appropriate. And the reason, without going too far down that rabbit hole, but I just want to complete the loop here, is because of what's known as the constrained action hypothesis. And basically, if you give people too much information, too much noise, that constrains the motor system. It constrains their ability to kind of internalize and then, most importantly, act or transmit that information in a way that's personal and makes sense to them, what I call talking in color in my book. So anyway, basic, went undergrad Kansas State, went and did some internships. I wanted to get a lot of practical experience, and then it wasn't until later in my career when I went and got my master's degree and wanted to kind of forge ahead in that domain.
Wow, that sounds like an awesome journey. I think there's a lot of parallelisms, it sounds like, between physical therapy and a lot of the stuff that you did. I know that there's a distinct process for becoming a certified personal trainer. And is your educational path kind of similar to that between like personal trainers and like the material that you had to go through in kinesiology? Like, how does that kind of run hand in hand?
The short answer is no. Personal trainers, as you know, that can be a fairly unregulated field. I mean, I think we all know examples, and you can see people that get online certifications and things like that from non-accredited sources, so I'm not saying there's not good personal trainers out there, but a strength and conditioning coach is a very different kind of field. Kinesiology and the route that I went with exercise science at Southern Illinois University later on was really more, I would almost say, medically driven. When I was taking some of the courses at K-State, that was a lot of what folks went into there was pre-med or veterinary med. If they ended up, after their first or second year, then they, hyper specialize in vet med. But a lot of pre-med, a lot of physical therapy, and folks going that route. I would say I was the rarity. As a matter of fact, I don't know anybody else in my field that I've been able to reconnect with in any fashion that became a strength and conditioning coach that I graduated with. Some of them did get into athletic training, personal training, and things of that nature. But my graduate assistantship, that was completely predicated. The only reason I went to get it, to be honest with you, is after I had volunteered with the University of Nebraska football team as a strength and conditioning coach. That was something that you need to have if you want to continue to coach high-level athletes in the collegiate setting, or even later on. You needed to have your master's degree, just because the field has gotten so competitive with scarce resources, with limited job availability. The master's degree is what makes you more competitive and helps you stand out. So I knew going back to college was going to be my best route to kind of codify my experiences together and also give really strong experiential learning from the standpoint that when I was a graduate assistant, I was an assistant for basketball and football, but I was basically the head strength coach for 5 to 6 other sports, 8 in totality, essentially by the end of it. And so that was really the reason I went, is very specific strength and conditioning experience, but could also get my master's degree at the same time.
Yeah, my program, when I went through the master's program at ECU, there wasn't a whole lot of strength and conditioning training. And I know that's not the goal of a PT school, right? That's not their job. But there are some professors out there and there are some classes in some PT programs that are really doing a good job of incorporating strength training and strength and conditioning. I know Dr. Scotty Butcher up at University of Saskatchewan up there in Canada, he does an amazing job of incorporating lifting into his classes, basically. And you've got to do all the exercises that, he's performing or you're going to be performing for your patients. It would be interesting to see, a lot more schools in the U.S. chime in and let us know if they were maybe doing some of those classes and some of the lifting and strength and conditioning stuff in their PT programs. Because, again, I know they're stretched kind of thin. They run a little low on time sometimes with what they can teach and what they have to teach. But it would be interesting to see more of that for sure.
Yeah, what you're noticing across the board is, integration it's paramount in any domain, but it's hard to achieve. And it's not hard to achieve because, people don't have the tacit knowledge and sometimes even the experiential knowledge. It's hard to achieve because factors related to human nature. In my domain, there's a lot of times where I'll support pro athletes in the off season, right? And so not only do I have to work with that athlete and whoever they're working with from a physical therapy standpoint or dietitian standpoint, but oftentimes I have to connect with their coaches. And even their coaches at the vast majority of NFL teams or NBA teams sometimes have communication barriers that they have to break through, within their organization. Because even though you might all wear the same logo, you might all kind of want the same outcome, right? The athlete performing at their best. The fact is everybody kind of is in it for themselves at that level of sport. Meaning if the team doesn't do well, people are going to get fired. They're going to look for people to pass the buck to. And then it creates this kind of self-perpetuating Machiavellian environment where, we did our part in strength and conditioning, but man, all we have on the athletic training side is this guy just does stim and ice all the time. There's no kind of functional rehabilitation, or the ATCs and the PTs and the strength coaches might say, we all did our part, but we don't feel like the sports science folks were sharing the information. So you almost kind of see this information hoarding, fear-mongering, self-preserving behavior. That's what made my time at Athletes Performance so special. When I was first started off in my career, Athletes Performance, which is based primarily out of Phoenix, Arizona. Now they're called Exos, bit of a different company now, but it was one of the primary and only companies at the time that really did this integration all under one roof in the private sector. So you had strength coaches, dietitians, physical therapists, everybody working under one roof. That was a big part of experiential learning at full scale integration for me, because at first I was down at the Andrews Institute. And so we'd get folks that came back from surgery from Dr. James Andrews, who's, well known and legendary in his side of the field. And we'd have to get these guys, as part of their return to play protocol, as far along in the process as we could, given their constraints. And you had to work hand in hand with the PT and medical staff. So that was an unreal learning opportunity for me as a young strength coach at the time. We'd do the movement screening, we do all the other pieces, the follow-up care, but you're working in conjunction with a bigger team, which is really what it takes to support today's athlete.
Yeah, Brett, you make a couple of good points there. You kind of hit them on them a little bit, but what are some of the biggest problems that you encountered when working with clients that maybe have experienced physical therapy from a clinical perspective or, even that team methodology of treating patients?
Yeah, well, there's stereotypes regardless of what we do, right? And clinical physical therapists oftentimes get a bad rap within with the folks that I work with because they just feel like it's this kind of routinized, come in, warm up on the bike, we'll do a few exercises with a tech, then maybe the lead PT will see you for a bit. Okay, now here's your follow-up exercises and out the door. At a high level, those things are done much differently. You're not focused around what the athlete can't do as much as what they can do. So a primary example would be oftentimes we were working with members of the United States Special Forces. They'd come in and, they would have a litany of injuries, right? They could be riddled with shrapnel. It could be affecting hip range of motion, neurosignaling, you name the list of maladies goes on. And you could always tell somebody that didn't have a whole lot of experience out of a direct clinic, because let's say the hip was an issue, right? Let's say they had a right hip issue, either as, as post-surgery or, just a major asymmetry, you name it. And they'd come over and they'd say, hey, no lower body today. Well, now you're dealing with the psychosocial shrapnel, so to speak, of telling somebody that has dedicated their life towards achieving an outcome, and even though something's only wrong with one limb, you said no lower body, you've limited them further. And so I'll never forget the look on an athlete's face or operator's face when they'd look and they'd say, hey, my other leg's fine. And that's true. The best physical therapists I had been around understood. They'd say, hey, Brett, listen, right leg, we're still working on some things. He's not cleared to go yet. However, we can do modified upper body, and then they can work the left limb. And we know that that doesn't contribute to any gross asymmetries due to the nature of neuromuscular crosstalk and the research showing that, actually, if you have one affected limb, training the other one can help reduce the amount of atrophy. So, you can always tell folks that have kind of just been isolated to the clinic and maybe haven't seen this diverse population that sometimes they don't have a choice. Telling them just to rest or telling them to immobilize and telling them to do these things is not an option, especially when millions of dollars is on the line, or in the case of United States servicemen or women, lives of their colleagues and those, their partners are on the line. So that's the biggest difference I know, right? Like is you just see people that know how to work and say, hey, there's always a way around it, and we can modify and we can address all the weak links while not sacrificing the stronger points.
For sure. I think those are a lot of good points, Brett. And even so, too, like what you mentioned before, that big key of actually collaborating with each other and really talking with each other instead of kind of being rather separate in the silos. I think that's a really, really good point. It seems that, at least from our perspective, that a lot more PTs are going more into the strength and conditioning aspect. And do you see the reverse happening with people in S&C and exercise science, with them going into more of the rehabilitation aspect, or is that not what you see?
I think it depends. I think there was a lot more of that 5 to 10 years ago. I think that there was this big call to arms that, and this was kind of with the functional training fad that hit, where people, what they were calling functional training was more about nuanced exercises than it was really the actual adaptational based outcome, right? And what I mean, just so listeners have a clear idea, because I don't want to speak in tongues, is, a lot of times people thought functional training was, oh, look, I'm on a stability ball while doing a dumbbell bench press, or here I am standing on a BOSU ball while doing a single arm curl to press, and they would try to hype that as this is functional, because now we're working not only the muscles, but we're working, on balance, coordination, proprioception, what have you. Well, a deadlift is pretty friggin' functional, right? Like I would guarantee the rest of the money that I'll ever make in my life and my relationships that the vast majority of people around the world are going to pick something up in the next day or two, or perhaps even the next week. So when people would say, deadlift is dangerous, do this instead. Well, no, you have to change your lens of functional. So anyway, at one point in time, I think we had that. I think a lot of people were kind of really infatuated with what they thought was great performance therapy or physical therapy, and also strength and conditioning. Now, and you used the term earlier, I think people have really kind of come around after the pendulum quit swinging so much to this idea of, hey, you know what? It's okay to own your domain and then just refer out. Admittedly, that was a bitter pill for me to swallow at one point. Like, I've just always felt pressured that, and it's mainly from myself, right? Like, I'm sure you guys can speak to this. If not, feel free to laugh at me. But I've always just felt like I'm somebody that has to be all things. And that's just my own pressure, right? Like, I want to be good at something because I care about it. I want to learn everything I can about it. Oh my gosh, please let me go. And then what I realize is, when you try to do that, you actually do the opposite. You become pretty crappy at a lot of things. So I just really focused on getting a great network around me. There's some things I'm okay not knowing, and I refer out to close friends that are specialists in those areas.
Yeah, absolutely. Own your strengths and just, play to them. And then it's actually, to me, I've found in my career, it's more beneficial to be able to say, hey, I can't really help you with that aspect, but I know a guy who can, so let's send you over there,
No question. And
I feel like patients appreciate that a lot more.
Yeah,
for sure.
We just, we live in this society where uber experts, right? Everybody's an expert. Everybody's trying to get their name out there. I have no problems with just saying, hey guys, I'm probably not the best go-to here, or I'm not as up on the research on that as I should be. Let somebody else handle that. I really try to focus on physical development, strength and conditioning, enhancing the neuromuscular system, getting people stronger, faster, more durable, and then also the behavioral aspect, right, as detailed in my book. There became a point in time where I just noticed that we're bombarded by more physiological information every day. I think Eric Schmidt, the CEO of Google, at the time that I had written the book, they had said that literally, almost every day now we create as much information as we did from the time up to 2003. Like it was something crazy, like 2 exabytes of data we do every day or every few days. Like that's insane. And what you're running into is, we'd see interns come in all the time and they can always tell you, hey, I read this and I read that. And what about this? But on this person's blog, it said that. And then when it was time for them to actually coach, like lead a group or lead somebody through a session, they were absolutely clueless. They couldn't do it. And that's because, you have to understand true social intelligence as well as domain-specific intelligence, but it's becoming a rare thing today. At least I feel like that. Do you guys have that issue? Do you see that, like more and more people coming in that have the appropriate background and schooling and all that, but just can't put 2 and 2 together in the applied sense?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And I will honestly admit over here that was me when I first came out of school. I've been out for about 2 years and I feel like I knew all this material and stuff. But then I was like, oh my God, I can't actually connect with people. Like I'm missing something totally here. And that's what's screwing me up. So I agree. I mean, and it's a hard road. And, I've learned the hard way through a lot of failure. And then I've, taken courses in education on how to get better at it. And it just seems like the other stuff is important, but I think you're making sure you get that person on board and really understanding them and their needs and communicating into the way that makes sense and aligns with their goals is really the first step. Otherwise, you can have the best treatment in the world, but it's not going to go.
Right. Yeah. And I want to be clear because, for anybody that hasn't read the book, and I'm sure there's a lot of them because, I don't, my book's not, I'm not Angela Ducksworth, right? Like it's not being promoted by everybody and it's all over the Wall Street Journal, but it's done fairly well in the domain, right? And the book isn't about warm, fuzzy leadership. Make sure to communicate with people in a way that you'd like them to talk to you. Like the book straight up just talks about some mistakes that some of the world's top professionals have made when leading and communicating, and how those mistakes usually dial down to not understanding human nature, not understanding the situation, or not understanding the nuances of what the research now shows about communication. And the point of the book wasn't to rewrite that, right? Like we wanted the book to be a combination of science. So what does some of the behavioral science research say out there, both psychology, sociology, and the like, but also real applied stories. We wanted it to be readable, digestible, but also immediately applicable because, now more often than not, you get a book about communication or working with people or leadership or coaching, and it's almost the same book written over and over again, right? Like I just feel like we've been inundated with these kind of sing-songy books, and I wanted to write something a little bit more specific towards practitioners in our field.
Yeah, for sure. Clearly, there's a lot of research that shows the benefits of strength training for injury reduction, reducing common musculoskeletal problems, and improving many other bodily aspects. And of course, realizing that being a conscious coach and getting your client on board with you and your plan is the first step. But besides certified strength and conditioning and what educational stuff you've gone through, what do you recommend are some good continuing education classes, podcasts, or resources, or whatever the case may be, that you feel have been the most helpful with improving one's exercise prescription and strength training clinical toolbox?
Yeah, books. And we could go on for days, right? It's funny. I'm certainly not that old. I'm 31. But when I first started off, it was almost hard to find things online of, hey, what's a great strength and conditioning reading list, or what's something I could do to learn more about movement. Now, with a simple tap into Google, you can find reading lists provided by various staffs at local universities, at the pro level, at the private sector level. So if anybody ever runs out of books, I promise you with a simple Google search, you can lock those in. Now, some of my favorites, and I'm sure I'll forget some here, Science and Practice of Strength Training by Vladimir Zatsiorsky, Super Training by Mel Siff and Verkhoshansky. You have the earlier, I would say it's now Every Day is Game Day is a great one. Vern Gambetta's Athletic Development. A classic one, and some may disagree, but I thought there was a lot of value to it. The Path to Athletic Power by Boyd Epley. And, of course, you have Gray Cook's books, right, like Movement. That's classic. And, I'd like to think I can push mine up there as well from a pedagogical standpoint, right, getting people to understand coaching. But I think, if you can get Super Training, Science and Practice, you can get Practical Programming, the 3rd edition by Mark Rippetoe. And then from there, you can really go down as far as the rabbit hole as you want, right? There's great books by Tudor Bompa called Periodization. Franz Bosch has a lot of ones on the nuances of running and sprinting. It goes on and on. I feel like right now we're not lacking for books or texts. I feel like we're lacking for true experience and more applied, right, situations. I just think that we have far more physical therapists and far more strength and conditioning coaches than we have jobs. People really have to up that part of their game and be willing to do unpaid internships, do volunteer situations. I mean, I've moved 15 times for strength and conditioning, and I'm on my 10th state because I wanted to go anywhere I could. And I don't come from a trust fund family, right? Like these weren't easy moves to make financially, but you've got to lock those things in. I'll make it easy, Brandon. If anybody wants more book recommendations, if you just go to my Instagram at Coach Brett B, I put tons of books that I recommend on my feed. All you have to do is scroll back to October of 2016, and I did a whole series of posts where I'd basically put 9 or 10 of my favorite books in one post, lock that in, because I actually get that question quite a bit. And then, some of the ones that I reference in my book are great resources as well. So hopefully that helps. Aside from that, I'm a big advocate on reaching out to strength and conditioning coaches, reaching out to people. There's a great website by my friend Derek Hansen called strengthpowerspeed.com. He is great friends with a world-class physical therapist named Rob Panarello, and you'll see Rob's name mentioned several times in Derek Hansen's writing. But Rob is somebody that really, really understands how to blend strength and conditioning with proper physical therapy, and is a no-brainer for anybody to look up if you're listening to this.
Well, Brett, that's actually a perfect segue into our next question. What do you think is the way to bridge that gap between PTs and strength and conditioning coaches? Do you think it's more collaboration, more cross-networking at events, or, what can we do to really bridge that gap?
Yeah, I think it's collaboration in general, and I can say that firsthand because when I worked at Athletes Performance, that was what really got me thinking along those lines and really gave me a holistic mindset. Like every day, having to interact with the performance therapists that we had in staff, and every day them having to come over. I mean, we'd have an athlete that, was just now returning to the training floor, was fully cleared. They'd be doing, cleans and front squats and a variety of movements, and the therapist could come over and kind of watch how they were doing and kind of get an idea of like, okay, how they progressing, any pain, any problems. And I'd say, hey, you know what? They had a little bit of an issue with that front rack position, but it was mainly just discomfort. He wouldn't rank it as pain. And we'd be able to kind of figure that out right then and there. Or the therapist would come out in the field when I'd be doing a feet or agility session, and they'd simply say, hey, what's on the docket today? And I'd provide an alternative kind of program that I had written out with exercises all the healthy guys were doing, the ones that were medically cleared in black, and then substitutions for guys that we were kind of easing back into training in red. And I'd lead these sessions, and the therapist would watch and kind of, get feedback real time, and then they'd provide their feedback afterwards. And that was, we were forced into that discussion, whether you wanted to have it or not. So I think it's just crossing that barrier, making yourself accessible. That's huge. You've got to make yourself accessible. I mean, it was a no-brainer for me to jump on your guys' podcast. I was telling a friend earlier about the nature of the show you guys are doing, and he said, so you don't just do podcasts with strength coaches? And I said, well, no. There's plenty of people out there that need this message and understanding of, holistic, being able to work together, and it's all for the good of the athlete or the client or the individual, however you want to term it. So exposure, knocking those walls down, reaching out to people, spending time, driving to local universities or clinics and just asking for 30 minutes of their time, all those things are invaluable.
For sure. And I think that was a really good answer and good take. And, from your perspective, Brett, with looking to collaborate and refer with trusted and competent providers, in your opinion, what qualities constitute a great physical therapist?
That's an awesome question. And it is hard because you'd like to say just overall intelligence, but I've worked with some very, very intelligent therapists that were extremely difficult folks to, work with, I guess, is the uneloquent way of saying it, right? And so just somebody that's a skilled practitioner is not enough. You have to have somebody that's walked a mile in those shoes before, hopefully somebody that's been an athlete or competed at some level. They know what it's like to have pain. They know what it's like to have to overcome or work back from an injury. They've kind of been in those shoes because injury is a terrific strain on an athlete's psychological profile. And people think it's just the physical piece. It's not. I mean, I had back surgery 2 years ago to correct something that I've dealt with since I was a young kid. And being able to come back from a back surgery, specifically a microdiscectomy, that gave me a tremendous amount of insight as to how I'd adapt my programming, adapt my approach for other folks that are coming through that. And so I think you have to have therapists that have walked it, that have done it. It's really hard, to be honest with you. And I'm not trying to single anybody out, but like, it's hard to work with therapists that just don't train. I don't mean don't exercise, right? Exercising is like one thing, but a therapist has to train. I could never listen to a therapist that would say, hey, no hang cleans, no modified snatches, and no safety squat, or, choose your exercise because he's still dealing with X, Y, or Z. Well, okay, if there's a direct issue and I can see there, right, like that the guy shouldn't be doing those things because of something with the wrist or what have you, I get it, where the problem is immediate. But if he's working his way back and it's just like, hey, we're 6, 12, 18 weeks out now from being cleared, he's got to work into some of this. I've seen therapists, Brandon, that have just said, hey, I don't want any more of these exercises because he had this issue in the past. Well, you can't do that. These athletes,
I agree.
In my case, they're going back on a field or a court or choose your competitive domain where they're going to smash into things, crash into things. Or if it is a non-contact sport, they're absorbing forces. Take tennis, for example. They're absorbing forces every time they decelerate that are anywhere from 4 to 8 times their body weight. And then they've got to change direction. Performance can't be pretty. And I need a therapist that understands that and has worked back through those things on their own, as well as somebody that stays up on current practices and research.
Yeah, Brett, I'm going to kind of switch things around here and turn the tables on you, but as a physical therapist, what qualities should I be looking for in a strength and conditioning coach?
Somebody that's open and not ego-driven. And if you know the strength and conditioning world, that is very hard. Strength coaches are oftentimes very hard-headed. They don't think you know anything unless you can do X, Y, or Z. Like, strength coaches are an interesting breed in general. Of course, I'm not speaking for all of them, but we're a hard group sometimes. So I think you just have to have somebody that's got a willingness to learn, first and foremost, a willingness to communicate. I used to go over and I would watch our physical therapists do manual therapy, dry needling. I'd ask them questions. I would just sit there and try to talk shop with them. And they were always awesome about sharing those things. So I think communication, I think a willingness to learn, and, just the ability to let go and say, hey, you know what? I'm not going to try to program. Let's say we're talking about a shoulder injury, right? Strength coaches sometimes will just say, oh, I put some rotator cuff work in there and we're doing some stuff to enhance, scapular stability and yada, yada, yada. Well, okay. And how do you know you're doing that? Well, because I chose these exercises and, that's what we learned. Yeah, but there's compensatory mechanisms that really could take what you think that exercise is doing and make it do something else, right? So there were some times where it's like, that's okay. I'm going to let you guys handle more of the rehabilitation, more of those kinds of nuances. I'm going to handle everything that has to deal with kind of the gross motor patterns, the sequencing, keeping the other parts of his body robust and strong. And then, I'll integrate the things that you tell me to integrate. And that's huge. You have to be able to collaborate and let go and let somebody else be the specialist sometimes if you want to have any hope at achieving an outcome-driven goal.
Yeah, for sure. I think you brought up a lot of great points, Brett, on that, and a lot of them which I agree. Someone who is a really good communicator and who treats people well, who has good customer service. I think someone who is competent and someone who has a good amount of knowledge, and not, of course, no one knows everything, but someone who has a good amount of knowledge on the subject matter, and someone who's always willing to learn and they can put their ego aside, and someone who you're able to talk with together. To me, that's something that I think that's the qualities at least I look for. And I think a good way, at least, that I've heard from other people too, is actually be a client of the other person. I don't think it's always realistic, but I can see how, getting into the patient's shoes and then, you be the patient and then go through their program could really, you're not going to get a better insight than that.
Yeah, I mean, and you're right. It's not always going to be realistic, but yeah, like no question. I just think that you have to be able. Normally I'd say it's empathy, but the research is saying that empathy is not the correct word. It's compassion. Empathy is I feel what you feel. Compassion is I understand what you feel. And, there's going to be a lot of situations where it just takes a higher level understanding. And, athlete is a relatively inclusive term I use. So whether you're working with, middle-aged geriatric populations or you're working with Dontari Poe of the Atlanta Falcons, right? The human body is we're made to be athletes. So, I use that as an inclusive term, certainly not meant to scare anybody off. If there are practitioners, listening that will never work with that population, that's fine. Your people are athletes. Somebody that's listening treats a CEO of, some small business or a large business that is an avid cyclist, that puts hundreds of miles behind them, in a given time frame, and has suffered some kind of knee issue or low back issue, and it just wants to get back to hitting the pavement. So, we have to be mindful of the terminology that we use. We have to be mindful of the messages that we share, and we have to be mindful of the power, relatively speaking, that we hold on to. You've got to relinquish those things to really create a great supportive environment for the athlete.
Awesome, Brett. Great take on that. We like to finish off each episode with a question to each of our guests. If you could change one aspect of exercise or strength and conditioning education or any higher learning, what aspect would you change and how?
Yeah, I would, that's a fantastic question, and it's a quick response on my end because it's needed. There is no education on strength and conditioning in terms of formal settings. I think you maybe have a small handful of universities and maybe only 2 that I could name right now that have formal strength and conditioning curriculums. That's a problem because kinesiology and exercise science can give you base rudimentary knowledge of the body's physiological and biomechanical and neuromuscular systems. But I had 0 classes in either graduate school or undergrad that taught me anything about proper program design, exercise selection, or anything of a sort. And if it did, it was old. It was still like machine-based training. Very little of it was ever any emphasis on anything ground-based or not related to a circuit. So, I thought the adaptational-based information that we got was good, right? Like what happens when, humans deal with this kind of stress and that kind of stress. But exercises and proper program design and periodization and planning and all those things can't be omitted because those are the things that we use to derive an adaptation. They go hand in hand. So we need more of a formal curriculum taught by people that have a modicum of experience in those domains because, the texts are just outdated. And I think that for some reason, I'm not sure why strength and conditioning isn't even an option, right? You have all these things for pre-med, pre-PT. People can go and specialize in being ATCs, everything else. But it's like if you want to get into human performance, you're just basically forced to submit to a general route and then go seek domain-specific knowledge after you've graduated. I did 2 unpaid internships just so I could get on the floor and learn how athletes were really trained. And, so that's what I would change. Of course, there's volunteer opportunities. So if anybody's listening and they are interested, please learn from my mistake. And when I was a freshman, I remember telling my advisor, and I love him to death. He meant well. He just didn't know. I said, hey, I want to work with athletes for a living. And at the time, he just said, hey, you can open up your own gym, or there's this thing called CrossFit. And I was like, well, I don't think those are my routes, but, I appreciate it. And little did I know that later on, I didn't know the school had a situation where you could volunteer to be a strength and conditioning intern and do this and do that because none of my friends were strength coaches. I didn't have any mentors that were strength coaches. So if you're listening to this, you want to get interested in it, or involved in it, your university very likely offers those internships, whether it's with football or Olympic sports. Go down there and ask. But yeah, I just think more formalized education. It's actually something I'm working on right now with my company, The Bridge, we're focusing a little bit more on the art or the science behind the art of coaching. But we're going to be doing some online courses related to the book, aspects of the book, how to make those pieces more applied to create better skilled communicators. Yeah, so that would kind of be my long answer on that. You can tell I'm not passionate about it at all.
I know, right?
It's a little irritating, right? It's something that a lot of coaches and I talk about, as part of the reason. Listen, like people are in pain out there. People need help. And when you don't have formal education programs based upon these things that are setting students up for practical experience, it slows, the entrance of educated and not only that, talented practitioners into the field. Put it this way, all the information in the world certainly isn't reducing the amount of injuries that is happening on a daily basis, either through general population or athletes.
So Brett, thanks so much for the insightful discussion. It was great to hear your take on all those things. It was really good to kind of hear this from a different role for that matter. Where can our audience find you online and on social media?
Real easy. I'm most active these days on Twitter and Instagram at Coach_Brett with 2 T's, B as in boy. So at Coach_Brett with 2 T's and then B as in boy. That's where I post a lot of everything from thoughts on training to videos and pictures of me training and what have you, you can go to bartholomewstrength.com. If that's a mouthful, just go to bridgehp, as in hello and Paul.com, and that is what we'll be building out soon. So social media and bridgehp.com. If you're interested in my book or further thoughts, you can find that on Amazon by searching Conscious Coaching.
Thanks so much for coming on, man. We appreciate your time.
Pleasure was mine. Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you for attending class today, and we hope that you learned something and gained value from the content.
If you'd like to schedule office hours with us, feel free to add us on Twitter at HET Podcast, on Instagram, HET Podcast, on Facebook, the Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast, and the homepage, healthcareeducationtransformationpodcast.com.
And for those of you following along in the syllabus, extra credit can be obtained by liking us, sharing us, and leaving a review.
Let's continue our journey up Mount Educational Success as lifelong learners.